I just recently read an article from TechRadar about exploring the gameplay mechanics of romance. Romance. Romance is quite an interesting subject to explore, especially in video games. How are you able to make a romance game that is immersive and compelling? Well, the answer is definitely not Life is Strange and Gone Home.
In Life is Strange, though much of the romance is told through cutscenes, it's interesting that player is the romantic target of the character Warren rather than the one seeking romance. The player is given complete control over whether or not any kinds of romance happens, and at the same time is given an interesting insight into the annoyance of relentless cloying pursuit approach games like BioWare have a stake.
In Life is Strange, there's no such thing as a romance mechanic. There is a romance story. There's a way in which you can make Chloe kiss you in the end, but that's it. If it's a true romance game, then it would have given me more options to date any other characters, but, well, I can't date any other characters. The game focuses on Chloe and Max. Chloe's story is the core part of what makes the entire game. She is the Kurisu to Max's Okabe. In fact, wait a second. A girl who died got saved by the main character through time travel, but using time travel actually ends up disastrously? Now I get it. If someone would tell me that I would get stranded in an island with my laptop and my choice of games are only Steins Gate and Life is Strange, you go back to Tumblr. And Gone Home? Gone Home is even worse.
In Gone Home, an even more balance is struck between the passive telling of a love story that doesn't directly involve the player and the interactive agency of game mechanics. The love story that's told in Gone Home is entirely dependent on the player physically interacting with the game's environment and being mentally engaged enough to put together the full story from the fragments they uncover.
You know, I've played Gone Home, and one of my biggest criticism of Gone Home is exactly on that paragraph. The player is not involved in the main story. There's a huge disconnect between the gameplay story of Gone Home and the actual story of Gone Home. The gameplay story of Gone Home is about you, the player character, breaking into someone's house, tampering into things in the middle of the night, and trying to figure out what's going on and why isn't anybody around. The main story of Gone Home is about closet lesbians in the 90s who suffers through discrimination because it's the 90s. The player is not involved in the story of the two lesbians directly, which would have been so much better because in that way the players can actually decide how the story goes and what decisions to pick on the story. But they decided to just tell the story to us through narration and showing a couple of things that are being left out in the home, which makes the gameplay feel a little useless. I've seen ludonarrative dissonance being discussed in games before, but if the disconnect of those games can be solved by small wooden logs from the Fall of Edgar, Gone Home's narrative dissonance needs the fucking Golden Gate Bridge fresh off of the Bay Area. So what the article essentially tells you is that the best of the best romance mechanics in the game is the ones that do not have any gameplay mechanics at all, do not involve the player with the romance directly, and just have the romance to be passively told you in an external story.
Not only does this help them retain a sense of agency and increase their engagement in uncovering the story, it allows the writers to forego melodrama and instead tell a story that feels natural and human. Though this mix of interactivity and passivity is simple, it's effective and it's a method would be interested to see narrative experiments with more.
Well, if you put it that way, might as well make a movie instead of a video game. I mean, if the story disconnect of Gone Home is the peak example of what makes a good romance game, I think we're setting the bar way too low. I mean, it's a video game. Why is the best romance mechanics in a video game is a romance that is passively being told to you? Well, I hate to say this, but that's actually a good question. In our modern technologies for today, no matter how hard it is for us to explore romance, it's still a little difficult to actually make a good romance game without stumbling into the usual flaws of what makes a video game. This is why we're going to discuss those flaws today. We're going to explore the intricacies of romance in video games and how to explore them correctly in one of the most advanced entertainment medium of all time. So if we all want to create something out of the greatest entertainment medium of all time, we all need to understand the capabilities and the limitations of those creative mediums. Video games stem from the word video and games. Games meaning a competitive activity involving skill, chance, or endurance on the part of two or more persons who play according to a set of rules, usually for their own amusement or for that of spectators or for competition. Now, video games mean games presented in a video form. It's now using rendered graphics and complex programming to simulate the game scenario with its own sets of rules, and the players have to use their skills and endure the game's challenges to beat it and win it. Unlike games in the real world, you can play video games on your own. Single-player games and multiplayer games exist out there. If you're on single-player, you're playing against the game's pre-programmed AI with their own sets of behaviors and circumstances. There are multiple purposes of video games. People play video games either for competitive purposes or for entertainment purposes. So what does this have to do with romance? Well, you need to understand the purpose of making a romance video game. Why make a romance video game? Is it going to be a side mechanic in your main game, or is it going to be a dating sim of some sort? Is it going to be competitive, or is it going to be for amusement? Since it's a video game, what is the competitive and skill-focused nature of a romance video game? What is the amusement that you're gonna take out of a romance video game? And this brings me to understanding romance. Unfortunately, as someone who has yet to fall in love with someone in my entire life or felt how it feels like to love someone, I don't think I'm nearly as qualified to talk about such matter. I'm still single and still virgin, and I have no girls that I am particularly interested in, and I have zero interest in relationship at all. So I'm stuck here being single for now, and that's perfectly fine. However, we're dealing with fictional romance. While writing fictional romance would be so much better and more authentic if the writer has personally experienced what romance is before, I think as long as you can make the characters act logically and make sense and not act like idiots, unless the story explains why the characters act like idiots, or they're aware that they act like idiots, or they learn from their idiotic behaviors, well, that's too much of a restriction. Basically, just try to make it good. And when I say try, I mean do try. It's okay if you start off writing terrible things. Great writers make thousands of garbage before finally making masterpieces. Artists draw garbage before they actually become good. Key here is to try and try and try. Being a YouTuber, for example. If you want to see it, watch my videos from like last year or maybe 2011 just to see how far I have progressed, and maybe comment, future me brought me here. Anyway, going back to the romance dynamics, the most beautiful part of romance is the chemistry between two actors before they finally become a romantic partner. The chemistry is ultimately what should be the target gameplay, maybe starting from the introductions, the dialogues, the flirting, the sex even. The narrative themselves will cover up the moments between each gameplay sessions. All needs to be mixed up in a variety of emotions that can engage the player with the romance partner in the game. Now, while this is indeed one of the most, if not the most fun aspect of romance, implementing chemistry in a video game is unfortunately very difficult, and you're gonna need to understand some of the key points that make it difficult to implement. First of all, the beautiful chemistry of romance is involved between two actors, two human beings, humans who have agency, free will, strengths, weaknesses, and most importantly, dynamic and real time. Real-world romance mechanics are always going to beat up video games simply on the fact that the opponent is a real-life human being who have their own flaws and weaknesses. Romance in and of itself is in a lot of ways a game on its own. So if something already is a game, why is implementing it in a video form is just so difficult? Well, the answer is simple. The player have agency on their own. They're the ones who can wander around the game world and join into the game on its own rules. The only problem is we are missing the other actors' complete agency. If you're playing a romance game, you're ultimately going to go against the AI, a pre-programmed character. Other video games program AI for combat behaviors and actions, and they are in a lot of ways either randomized or they learn from the player's behaviors in the game. It's a lot easier to program AI that combats you instead of an AI that talks to you and chats to you like a human being. Why? Because AIs don't talk. Now, I know that you're going to point out to Cleverbot and say, hey, AIs can communicate too, but even Cleverbot is not perfect, and implementing Cleverbot to every single AI in games like GTA is, well, the programming languages between the two are in a lot of ways incompatible. Even if you can have Cleverbot intelligence in every AI in the game, you can't have someone to voice every single thing that they say, so you'll end up using a voice generator which breaks immersion. And let's just say that you do have a natural voice generator and can implement Cleverbot's algorithms into every single AI in the game, combine that with a gameplay like, say, GTA, and, well, let's just say that it's about as equivalent as pouring lava to your processors. Or how about AIs that do talk? Well, they talk because of pre-recorded voice files being played when certain actions are triggered, and AIs can comprehend actions and situations much better than they can comprehend dialogues. Now, I know that this is basic Java and not actually the language for the AI programming. I just want to highlight how the logic works in its most basic framework for presentation purposes. For example, playing as a terrorist and putting a bomb in A is going to have a terrorist say, the bomb's in A. Or maybe have a counter-terrorist realize that the bomb's in A. If the counter-terrorist didn't know where the bomb is, they're gonna go out for a search. When a counter-terrorist goes into site B and finds out the bomb is not there, then they're gonna say, B clear. Follow it, Roger and Roger and Roger. It's not only limited to actually triggering voices, they can also trigger certain functions. In Doom 2016, for example, if the player is far, the imps are going to throw fireballs at you. If the player is close, then they're going to charge and strike melee. The Cyber Demon will unleash new, deadly attack forms by the time its health goes below 50%. What I'm trying to say is, in order for AIs to respond to certain actions, they need to have objective measures that prompt said response. The fact that the bomb's in A is an objective fact. The fact that the bomb's in B is an objective fact. The fact that the player is far from the imp, like a couple of meters away, is an objective fact. The fact that the Cyber Demon's levels are below 50% is an objective fact. It's easy to program AIs when they are working in objective parameters because, well, they're AIs. They're programmed within specific sets of parameters. The problem with romance mechanics in games is that there's no technology sufficient enough for an AI to respond into dialogues that human beings produce, even though dialogues are like the most important aspect in building the romance chemistry. That is assuming that voice recognition technologies can recognize the things that you say 100%, which they don't. The reason is because AIs cannot comprehend the sentences that you say and what they actually mean in context. AIs cannot comprehend irony or sarcasm. For example, if I say, I really hate it when people say, hey, let's kill all the Jews. AIs cannot read my last sentence. They're gonna read it literally, even though it's obviously meant to highlight the point and not what I'm actually saying. They're gonna read me saying kill all the Jews, even though that's not what I mean when I say that. If the mainstream media is being run by a bunch of AIs, I'm really not surprised. So if the AIs cannot comprehend the things that you say, how are we going to make a romance game and yet still make the romance to be authentic, real, and have lots and lots of dynamic and freedom throughout the entire thing? Well, you can't. Context comprehension is not something that both AI and even some human beings are capable of. So no, it's not going to be fully real. It's not going to have the same amount of freedom as real life romance. It's going to be a hell of a lot easier. It's going to break immersion in some ways, but we can try. And trying is better than not doing anything at all. So now we're going to explore the romance mechanics that already exist and see how they implement them. I've already talked about Gone Home and Life is Strange and how their idea of romance is basically either don't give the players the choice in what romance they want to pursue or don't involve the player in the romance story at all and have the story being told to you instead of being shown. I mean, this is a video game. The idea of a video game is to involve the player at something important. I want to see the story of the two lesbian chicks instead of wandering around the house scraping for things and hearing someone literally tell me the story in the background. I want to feel how it feels like being a lesbian chick in the 90s and being discriminated against, and try to pick up decisions of my own that might or might not lead into happiness. At least Life is Strange let me play as one. Now, how about the other games that have done romance mechanics? Well, we have a couple of examples. Now, you all know about the limits of what romance games can do, so how can visual novels like Katawa Shoujo tackle this mechanic with the game's limitations? Well, by simply having a non-linear story. Non-linear is not the same as complete freedom on anything. You're basically going to take the perspective of one character, namely Hisao, and you're going to decide what route that he's going to take. You're not going to decide what he's going to say or what he's going to think. It's basically reading a story being presented by visuals and audios while you as a player chose the route that you want Hisao to take by making certain decisions. The decisions that you make might not look significant at first, but in the grand scheme of things, it actually is. It will determine the endings that you will get, the routes that you will take, the character that you will romance. Do you have complete freedom over everything? No, but you do have control on some of Hisao's decisions, and those decisions are actually significant on who you're going to romance in the end, and whether or not it's going to end well or not end well. Is it literally a dating sim? No, a dating sim would have more options than that. A visual novel is just a novel being presented visually with multiple routes that you can choose. You can literally see the size and scope of this game through looking at the flowcharts. And yes, in a lot of ways, romance in game is basically a flowchart. You can say this one correct thing and that will lead you to another. Some conditions need to be fulfilled before you can actually get into this particular phase. let's explore another game's romance mechanics. I'm going to explore Mass Effect 2, and Mass Effect 2 specifically because Mass Effect 2 has a lot more options that you can romance from the start, as opposed to Mass Effect 3, where most of the romance carry over from either Mass Effect 1 or Mass Effect 2, and the romance is a lot more defined here compared to any other games in the series. So in Mass Effect 2, as male Shepard, you can romance Miranda, Jack, or Tali. As a female Shepard, you can romance Jacob, Garrus, or Thane. Either can romance Kelly Chambers and Samara, or Morinth, but only dumbasses romance Morinth. Liara's romance only carries over from the last game and you need a DLC to explore it further, so she doesn't really count. Anyway, how is the mechanics of Mass Effect 2's romance? Well, obviously, the first step is you need to complete a loyalty quest to the companions that you want to pursue, and you should complete all of them anyway so that you can get a good ending. After that, you basically just need to respond with Paragon things or Renegade things, depending on the character that you want to romance. Garrus, for example, you need to say that you're interested in him. And Tali, for example, you need to say that you're interested in her. Come to think of it, Garrus and Tali's romance dialogues basically consist of them basically arguing on how to have sex with Shepard. This isn't even counting on some of the most interesting possibilities, like if you basically have all your crew members survive the suicide mission, you can bang one character, dump the other, bang the other character, dump her, and bang the other. You can end up banging every single romance option post-suicide mission, which is freaking amazing. In both Kato Shoujo and Mass Effect 2, the dialogues that you pick on the decisions that you pick have their own pre-written narrative. You don't exactly have full control over the narrative. It still railroads you, but the railroad has good writing and great characters. You as a player just need to pick the route that you want to take with the characters that you want. Mass Effect 2 goes even further than Kato Shoujo in that you can choose what kind of dialogues that you want to pick, but thanks to Kato Shoujo being a visual novel and tells the story through text and static images instead of 3D rendered characters and spoken dialogues, it offers a lot more routes and outcomes than Mass Effect 2 because dialogues and text are a lot easier to produce than voice and audio and 3D rendered characters with proper lip sync. They take a lot of time to produce. How about other BioWare games like Dragon Age? I'm going to be specific to Dragon Age Origins here because Origins have a very interesting companion relationship mechanic in that every single action and decision that you take as the Grey Warden throughout the game will cause some form of impact to the companions that you chose. Choose good actions and Alistair and Liliana will love you more. Choose bad actions and Morrigan will love you more. Zevran, for the most part, don't give a fuck. The companions also have certain biases and gifts that you can give to them depending on their personalities. And if you do things that they don't like or say things that might not please them in some ways, of course your affinity with them is going to lower. In order to romance a character, you need to have your affinity to them to be high enough to warrant such a thing to happen. Some characters have specific romance quests necessary to trigger the intimacy to the other character, and after that, you can just basically talk to the character and say that you're interested in them. As you say that you're interested in them, you basically just need to pick the right dialogue choices in order for you to actually trigger the part where you can actually be sleeping with them. None of these games directly use dialogues that you as a player personally write yourself. These games use actions that the player take or specific dialogue options that the player chose. It restricts the player a lot more into the narrative, but it will actually make the narrative more consistent, presentable, and immersive while still giving the players choice. Strict choices, but still choices. So how are you able to make a romance game to have more dynamic elements being put into them? How are we going to create that romance game in which we can type in every single dialogue that we want and let the dynamic flow? Well, the article that I cited last time mentioned The Sims. The Sims methods on the romance is weird, let's just say. All you need to do is just to keep them talking and talking with the love interest sim, keep them happy, ask them to go out, have them talk with them, kiss them, make them love, and so on. In a lot of aspects, I think The Sims is the most dynamic romance game that I can think of that can simulate romance, no matter how weird the simulated romance gets. This is mainly because you don't really need to actually say anything, you just need to tell your sim to commit certain actions. Like for example, just have a sim to please talk to the sim and constantly talk to them. The Sims has a language called Simlish, which is basically gibberish, and it's easy to program characters talking gibberish and moaning gibberish rather than have them actually have real dialogues. And if you put real dialogues, it's basically just gonna get repetitive more and more. The Sims isn't exactly the most immersive of romance experience, but it's the one that came closer to actual romance mechanics than any other games in general. It can even progress so far as to marriage and having kids. Now remember the part where I talk about the chemistry and how the dialogues that you have between the characters are actually important? Well, you can actually turn the dialogues into familiar gameplay mechanics and not actually have characters talk to each other. Honeypop is a dating sim in a lot of respects, but the match 3 mechanics of Honeypop and how it relates into dating to the characters is actually pretty damn impressive. It's a really damn fun game to play. The romance mechanics is basically win the match 3 game and you score hot chicks. Makes absolutely no sense, absolutely not romance, absolutely not immersive, but hey, if it's fun and engaging, why the hell not? What Honeypop does is basically substituting the complex part of dating, which is the chemistry and the dialogues, with a familiar minigame, that's not bad. That could work. You can just basically replace, say, the talking with certain characters as shooting demons in your imagination. I don't know. So after browsing through all of those romance mechanics in the game, what is the most ideal romance mechanics that we can produce today? How can you make that ideal romance game that can still be fun and challenging, but also have a compelling story and narrative to the characters? Well, the most ideal of romance games cannot be defined objectively. You may have your own idealized romance game in your head, but it can probably be impossible to accomplish with current technologies. In my perspective, the current romance mechanics can either be a complete total freedom with total nonsensical immersion-breaking gibberish a la The Sims, in which the player just basically tell the Sims to just commit an action instead of commit dialogues. Well, the dialogue is the action, but not actual real dialogues. Or not so much freedom, but compelling, well-written characters and multiple routes a la Katawa Shoujo. You can also deviate from those things and just make a completely ridiculous romance game for fun and for the sake of gameplay mechanics. In the end, it depends entirely on what or how you want to execute your romance. Do you want to execute your romance games with total freedom, or do you want to execute your romance game with strict and predefined narrative structure? There needs to be a good balance between the story immersion, player involvements, and narrative structure within this romance game. I think the most immersive romances are those that restrict the player, oddly enough. This is because restricting the player allows for the game's narrative and the story to flow a lot better without the player's interruption too much. The only problem is, player involvement is still necessary. Life is Strange and Gone Home are not good examples of this because they don't directly involve the player and players don't exactly have too much choice at hand, and even then, it's not that significant. It's a video game. It needs to have the player to actually contribute something into the plot of the video game. Katawa Shoujo, on the other hand, does involve the player. It does involve players to pick on whatever decisions they wanted, whatever storyline they chose, and to pick on whatever girls they personally like on the story. And every storylines and routes are going to be different than the last. But to conclude this, in a lot of ways, video games are like magic tricks. They're supposed to give you an illusion of a scenario that is familiar to life in some ways. It won't be exactly as real life, but it's still something that is worth admiring. When you are the player, you're all going to enjoy the scenarios being presented by the games. But by the time you become a developer, which I was for a very small game, but developer still, you will realize that video games aren't as magical as they might seem, and that you can also pull off the same illusionary magic trick as well, if not better. The only problem is whether or not your magic trick is able to make people think that it's magic rather than, oh, it's just a magic trick. The idea is to immerse the player in that illusionary scenario instead of pulling them out of it and making them to think that this is just completely fake. Yes, gamers in general are aware that games are fiction, but the illusion of being inside that fiction, the immersive settings and scenarios, those are what pull people into games in the first place. Video games are, in the end, computer software designed to simulate certain game scenarios that might or might not be related to real life. The reason why romance in video games aren't essentially as in-depth or as engaging in real life is because everything is constrained within sets of programming parameters. Video games as a whole all end up being computer programming softwares with the purpose of entertaining rather than, say, calculate or store database. In order for romance mechanics to work, we need to have technologies that are sufficient enough to basically create a sentient life. Even the open world games that we see today are not as open or as organic as they might seem, as they're still pre-programmed AIs that operate within complex sets of behaviors being put into them. Video games are meant to put that illusion with audience interactivity, but unfortunately some aspects of real life are going to be quite difficult to implement no matter how advanced and interactive this medium can get. Let's all hope in the future that games can have more advanced AIs that can actually replace 3D women. That's all for the video today. If you like this, you can go ahead, click the like button, and subscribe for more. If you wish, you can support me at Patreon, and thanks for watching.